Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out about Emma Barrett Browning. This is called How to Lose Your Way. Salt upon your lips. Elizabeth is in bed again. The cough that's been troubling her since the first London autumn had settled on her chest. Never an early riser, now she's in order to lie until lunchtime and avoid getting out in a frost that is daggers for all weak chests. No one's exactly worried about her. Dr. Chambers is convinced that her lungs are without disease, but so weak that they are struggling against the cold air, which occasions the cough, but with one cold upon another falling upon the chest and producing cough, she hasn't left the house in 4 months. There's nothing gentle or genteel about such a cough, about gasping for breath, violent spasms, and the whole body forced into an upright position because to lie down is to suffocate into the too heavy air. Coughing without drawing breath, cough tell you wretch, eyes streaming, nothing to you but the red O of your coughing mouth, and then just when you think there's might be a moment's calm, the cough starts its obsessional insatiation, irrigation over again. At night, loud in the silenced house, your self-conscious coughing keeps not only you, but the person in the next bed and next room awake. Coughing and wheezing, hacking and whooping. None of this is the least romantic, and the paraphernalia that comes with it is not too much better. Inhaling a gloop that prisms and swirls slowly in streaming water, Elizabeth has to keep moving her long hair out of the way. Besides what to do with the gloop, she herself coughs up, whose flow of yellow, gray, and green mucus suddenly at the back of the throat and on her tongue. Lace handkerchiefs are wasted on this and heavy lifting of the respiratory system. Asthma meets bronchial infection in the cunning marriage. Asthma narrow bronchia for perfect harbors for infection and the gunk it produces. Those gummed up bronchioles in turn create the irritation that prevents increases asthmatic inflammation. Untreated childhood asthma prevents the lungs developing fully, thus ensuring itself a future in the body. So Elizabeth coughs. Although she's finding it hard to keep her spirits up, her third floor back bedroom window offers an austere view of parapets, high star ranking chimneys, and a slice of winter sky. Indoors, the chick hatched by her Barbary doves have died after protracting ailing one cold night, and the parent birds are so spiritless, songless, that she's brought the pair into her own bedroom to warm them up. As she pets them, it's almost as if she's pictured herself as the girl who fed the Hope End chickens by hand. And she should name it as a grief, but lose either of them, and the caged birds are a poor substitute for country air and childhood freedoms. Once again, paper friendships keep Elizabeth occupied. Now, instead of daydream about the ancient Greeks or admiring writers from afar, she has actual literary correspondence. John Kenyon, who's been unwell himself, sends her a manuscript, poems for the most part occasional, includes Destiny, which takes lines from her own version of Prometheus Bound, is an epigraph. She responds with a series of detailed critiques. Meanwhile, Mary Russell Mitford is thinking for applying for a raise in her civil list pension and asks Elizabeth to mobilize a council-in-law support. Miss Mitford's tone is particularly warm. My dear love, she opens on February 38. Have got to think of your obscurity of style, my love, merely the far-fetching and far-seeing of a spirit more elevated than ours. If this doesn't embrace the younger poet, it must boost her self-esteem. Sure enough, she's soon asking Kenyon about possibilities for publishing the Seraphim. Without a month, publication is underway, and with newfound confidence, Elizabeth is able to decline Mr. Boyd's offer to go through her proofs. My dear friend, I do hope that you may not be very angry, but Papa thinks, and indeed I think, that I have already had 2 proof sheets for 48 pages, and the printer has gone on to the rest of the poem. It would not be very welcome to them if we were to ask them to retrace their steps. Dragons are being slain all around. Do you know that Mr. Valpy is giving up business? She gossips, but with a little schadenfreude. She's yet to forgive her former publisher for how he handled her Prometheus Unbound. Perhaps it is a usual distraction from the book's critical failure, and has vowed to put no more mass to be changed to print, but Mr. Valpy's hands. She writes about her new collection to Miss Mitford with relaxed certainty, punningly invoking Lord Byron's famous take on sexual regret. Now, so now there is room for only the late remorse of fear. One reason for this changing tone may be developing social maturity, but Elizabeth also knows that these poems are good. With Papa, she believes the book's long title poem, rather than a dramatic lyric, than a lyrical drama, is the best thing she's written, and she has a strong vision for the volume as a whole. Like her previous book, it will start with a long piece, then would come to the poet's vow and Margaret, and several poems of a length almost equal to them, and some shorter ones at the end. As she writes these poems in her warm room, keeping one eye on the chill world outdoors, Elizabeth takes comfort from the fact that it's no longer just family who believe in her talent. She's joining a literary world. By March 38, even this busy life of the mind can disguise the fact that she hasn't been out of the house for 6 months and is incapable of any occupation which should not rather be called an imitation of idleness. She's actually aware of how this gets in the way of writing. But although ambition is a grand angelic sin, I have at any rate a long futurity of coughing to abstract me from it. Beyond her bedroom door, through the household mood has been lightening in recent months by a promise of permanent London address, months of wrangling over the lease of this potential home at 50 Wimple Street has left the family in tenterhooks, lest their lawyers are going to rob us of it. By spring 38, the move seemed increasingly certain, but then bad news arrives at Gloucester Place. How have the waves of pleasure and mournfulness chase each other over the sand of life? In February, the Barretts discover that Uncle Sam is dead. The shock affects Elizabeth, as all bad news does, psychosomatically. My strength flags a good deal and the cough very little. Uncle Sam, the family learned, died at Kingston on December 23rd, 37, while trying to get home from Spanish Town to Cinnamon Hill. The cause of death was pulmonary consumption, or TB, as though the family back in London had no idea of it, but he must have guessed he was dying. Possibly this is why the previous August he gifted Elizabeth his 1/8 share of the David Lion, a working vessel once used as a convict ship, together with the latest annual profit. Uncle Sam is survived by no legitimate children, and his gift marks the special relationship the two have enjoyed since he was uncle, brother, friend, and nurse when I lay in the long, weary sickness of Gloucester. When news of this generosity arrived, his kindness melted our dear Ba to tears, for she had thought from his long continued silence that she must be forgotten. In fact, he was probably too ill for letter writing, but she doesn't yet seem to realize that the significance of the money itself invested it will produce an annual income of around 200, equal to a little under 3 years' pay for a skilled laborer, combined with around 4,000 inherited from Grandmama, also invested for her. It means that usually for a woman at this time, Elizabeth could afford to live independently. This is not what happened next. Instead, as a visceral reflex, Papa summons his own son, the son who is brother, namesake, home from Jamaica. At 26, the former naughty schoolboy has become one of the most gregarious, outgoing members of the Barrett clan, and sent to Cinnamon Hill in 36. He has proved to ascend to the management of family affairs. He is also a young man with an appetite for life. It's no coincidence that among the siblings, he has a special bond with Henrietta, third and fourth in the surviving birth order, as Ba and Bro are first and second. The pair share an analogous bond of temperament and age, relishing socializing, dancing, and party going. Characteristically, when Sam does finally return to England in November 38, almost a year after his uncle's death, he takes a tour of the eastern seaboard of the U.S., including a visit to New York along the way. Indeed, even back in Britain, he doesn't rush home. He goes first to his old friends at Sidmouth. By the time he arrives in London, the family will be settled in at Wimple Street, and there they see their new home advantages and deficiencies through his eyes. Moving half a mile east from Gloucester Place means living in yet more built-up area of London. Elizabeth has not been keen on the move on account of the gloominess and the street and of the part of the street whose walks look so much like Newgate's turned inside out. Wimple Street, whose runs parallel with Harley Street, isn't an arterial thoroughfare like Gloucester Place. It is a little quieter, and it's also less imposing. Sam is in some measure disappointed with the width of the street, and this, however, I am reconciled, for the house is delightful of every respect. He also notices that London cold after the warmth of the Montego Bay. My room is warm as I wish it could be in bed, but as cold as my bitterest enemy could desire when out. But number 50 itself isn't anything grander than the old house, though constructed of plain brick. Apart from the stone-faced ground and lower floor, it's triple-fronted, comprising a basement plus 4 stories, 5 if you include the rooms of the mansard roof. A wide stone bridge leads to the front door with a magnificent peacock tail of statement fanlight. And the Barrett men arrive at Wimple Street in mid-April 38. Elizabeth and her sisters follow a few days because the house was so unfinished that we were obliged and glad to accept the charities of a kind friend and go to Crawford Street until the ghost of pain had been sufficiently exorcised. But once there, we liked the house very much indeed. She tells Miss Mitford, the dose of my books, and I have a little slip of sitting room to ourselves, and dearest Papa, in the abundant kindness, surprised me in it with the whole vision of majestic plaster heads from Bruciani's busts of poets and philosophers. The little slip of sitting room is a gift and acknowledgement and something of a gilded cage. It lays out the future that Elizabeth, of all the siblings, is expected to spend indoors reading and writing, and her father's abundant kindness is making this as pleasant as he can for her. Does in fact create an ideal condition for work, since it's not entirely true that, as Virginia Woolf will put it, a woman must have money and a room of her own as she is to write. The money, at least, needn't absolutely be her own, for now Papa's wealthy genuine enables Elizabeth writing life. In fact, Edward Barrett, Moulton Barrett, will receive such a bad posthumous press from his daughter's admirers, and it's worth reckoning up just how important has been her emergence as a poet. Ever since she was 14 and he paid for her debut publication, The Battle of Marathon, he has encouraged Elizabeth, writing both practically and emotionally. His admonitions have guided my youthful muse, even from her earliest infancy. As that volume dedication puts it, there's more to being born in the right family than financial comfort, access to the paternal library, and decent home tutoring, essential though these are. Without Papa's consent, an essay on mine would have been published when Elizabeth was 20. If he hadn't argued her to submit the manuscript, Prometheus Bound wouldn't have appeared when she was 27. In the first half of the 19th century, gifted women are dependent on fragile connectures to good fortune. It's Elizabeth's particular luck, for example, that her father isn't interested in rushing her daughters into dynastic marriages. Perhaps his own empire-building father-in-law put him off. In any case, a strong, almost fundamentalist religiosity has now combined with what he views as his own worldly failure to make him see prayerful morality as life's most important work, like nothing so much as the founder of one of those Catholic religious orders in which the nonconformist in him must disapprove. He leads a cloistered existence dedicated to study and prayer, not as half-lived, but as the best of all possible lives. We are dying, and all are dying around us daily. Eternity is hastening, be it our study to prepare for it, as he notes in a characteristically cheery missive to George. For this revivalist Christian, prayer is an active, even heroic, intervention of the world rather than a retreat from it. In making the virtually housebound Elizabeth a domestic repository for the Christian duty of watch and pray, he is allotting to her that he sees as a pivotal role, albeit one of the more than a passing resemblance to medieval anchoress or village sin-eater. In coming years, Papa will get in the habit of coming to pray with Elizabeth every night, but religiosity is just one phase of her cultured emerging obsession with a figure of an imprisoned woman. Beyond the emerging walls of the Barrett home, this is becoming highly sexualized. One of Elizabeth's emerging poetic peers, Alfred Tennyson, 3 years her junior, has already published 2 poems, Mariana in 1830 and The Short of Charlotte in 33, fetishizing walled-up women. Mariana in her moated grange, pining for lost love, is one of Shakespeare's spare characters from Measure for Measure. In coming decades, Tennyson's poem will inspire famous paintings by John Everett Miles and John William Waterhouse in a tangentially Arthurian story which generated three further Waterhouse canvases. His Lady of Shalott is locked in a tower and cursed to weep perpetually until she falls fatally in love with Sir Lancelot. He left the web, he left the loom. She made 3 paces, throw the room. She saw the water lily bloom and saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Thwarted sexually suffocates these fantasy figures, and it is striking how much they resemble later stories about Elizabeth, which she herself will protest. In 1844, she will be heard when someone who she liked by then thinks of her as a friend. Richard Hengst Horne presents her with a reclusive invalid. In his encyclopedic A New Spirit of the Age, their relationship will be never fully recover. A year later, she'll challenge even Robert Browning. Do you conjecture sometimes that I live alone like a Mariana in the moated grange? 20th century popular fiction will turn the indoor years of her 30s into a thrumming opetal drama, or else portray her as sexually unawakened, a damped up force ready to burst into creativity once she roused with a kiss. But if the reality of authorship is much more quotidian, it's also more self-directed. But also her father's support, it's Elizabeth's own strong will that has driven her forward through her piecemeal poetic education over the threshold of the banal and to writing of real literary merit. She is a big personality crammed into the small frame of a diminutive body and of a restricted life. That personality finds a space to emerge on the page. It's impossible to ignore the spiky intellectual charm of Elizabeth's letters, as when she beautifully folds double puns, reflexivity, and reflection into a thank you note to John Kenyon. I have not been asleep over Landor's work. It is easier to dream than to sleep over a volume of his, and perhaps very beautiful as these are in many parts, one of my dreams is that they express coldly and with a hard, stiff, stony outline that the Greeks they were living Greeks, were they not, as well as Greek statues? Nor can we discount the simpler, warmer tones she uses in Arabella about flannel waistcoats up to the throat and next the skin, and most of the most disagreeable things you can think of besides, provides that you happen to be particularly imaginative while you think. Tell us everything about everybody, us meaning Henrietta and me. I never show your letters, and so you may open your heart. Yet these are both ways of writing in persona. It's not that the petite brunette and her writing desk is faking it or being manipulative when she writes in an effusive young lady. She is trying to work out how to be herself. She's afraid of turning into an intellectual woman of the kind who's used to frighten me more than any woman I ever knew. There used to be fear for me, even in the pure intellect of her eye, in a way that she does fear is what she's always pictured as the masculinity within her own makeup, a poetic vocation that ever since her tomboy childhood has been muffled up with the almost exclusive male role models from Homer to Byron, with the available to her. Later generations of writing women will be released from similar anxieties by realizing that the intellect is gender free, or at least by recognizing that the male writers are simply the historical available models that are more history, that is, will change. By becoming a writer always has to do with individuation, a matter of making or failing to make private sense of the writing task. Elizabeth has always been understood that developing it as a writer is no accident, sharpening her technique. She treats even letters as a compositions. Now this process of poetic self-invention is bearing fruit. When the Seraphim appears in June 1838, its reception makes clear that this is a real achievement. Reviews start to appear immediately and are substantial. The Sunbeam's coverage extends across 10 pages and 5 issues, and honor it otherwise accords only to Thomas Carlyle's Sator Restauratus, framing her as an important new figure. Pieces appear in the Atlas, the Examiner, the Athenaeum, Blackwood's, the Metropolitan Magazine, the Monthly Review, the Literary Gazette, the Quarterly Review, and the Monthly Chronicle. In short, the Seraphim is one of the year's most reviewed books. The extensive critical reception will later be hand-recorded, shorthanded by scholars as mixed. In fact, reviewers speak with practically one voice, repeating the terms extraordinary and exceptional, a consensus best summed up by the Athenaeum. This is an extraordinary volume, especially welcome as an evidence of female genius and accomplishment, but it is hardly less disappointing than extraordinary, and even controversial, but undeniably important. Some critics object to religious verse and principle. Others complain that the collection's title poem is static and conceptually weak. But At the Atlantic points out the author depreciates such criticism by declaring she has not written a book but a suggestion, and does well to seize out this key line from her preface, because the Seraphim marks Elizabeth's shift from linear thought, philosophical argumentation, or narrative to evocation, sublimity, suggesting but not developed. As Monthly Chronicle says, the Athenaeum assumes that this is a loss of control. Miss Barrett's genius is of a higher order, active, vigorous, and versatile, unaccompanied by discriminating taste. 1,000 strange and beautiful visions flit across her mind, while the Monthly Review sees evidence of a singularly original mind that must be carefully directed and forcibly controlled. And Blackwood concludes that there is an originality in the whole cast and conception of the strain that beyond all dispute proves the possession of genius, but they are also disfigured by much imperfect and some bad writing. In short, autodidacticism is both Elizabeth's strength and her weakness. In regard, it is to be compared to Percy Blythe Shelley by both the Metropolitan Magazine and the Literary Gazette. Its penalty to be reminded that she is a woman, especially when considered as the compositions of a female. These poems must command admiration and awaken hope. Elizabeth may prefer the Athenaeum's observation that she addresses herself to sacred song with a devotional ecstasy. In 1838, religious poetry appears not dated but radical, even risky, because religion matters. Not for another 8 years will the doctrinal unorthodoxy and radical modern technique of J.M.W. Turner's Seraphim, his visionary, the angel standing in the sun, combine to confound viewers. In fact, ironically, now that Marsh Chapel and its stimulated theological entanglements are in the past, Elizabeth's own faith seems to be settling down within conventional bounds. Just as it once replaced her obsession with Greek prosody, now doctrinal argument has in turn disappeared from her correspondence. Both have been stages in the accidental education, which emerges as a poet of technical accuracy and ethical acuity. Both are also responsible for slowing her literary development, at least compared to men emerging from the forcing houses of good schools and university, forced to guide herself through the biographical highways and sometimes getting stuck in byways. Elizabeth is developing on a feminine timescale. Future admirers will imagine that had Elizabeth only been able to escape the parental home for happy marriage earlier, she would have survived longer and written more. The immatured woman fantasy, once again, the truth is that most read women in the early 19th century, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, Mary Shelley, before marriage and widowhood, write while unmarried. Even George Eliot and George Sand both chose cohabitation, a lifestyle that allows freedom of literary work. If Elizabeth had married before she received the literary world's imprimatur, her talents, like those of most women of the era, would have disappeared into household management, social respectability, and the repeated pregnancies by which they may well have been snuffed out, as Charlotte Bronte's were. Only fame can ring fence by writing time. Only late marriage will spare her already frail body the risk of numerous pregnancies. Mary Russell Mitford, less well known for her 21st century, but in her lifetime best-selling, is unmarried too. Her letters to Elizabeth are noticeably more effusive than others she writes, and it's entirely possible that this is only because she wants to encourage her shy protege, but that she might conceivably have a crush plainly doesn't occur to the younger woman who's busy being in awe. Indeed, it doesn't seem to me like a vision that I should know, and to be allowed to love you and write to you and think of you as my friend and picture yourself as a mentee, nor should we jump to this conclusion, for in 1838, being single or married says more about a woman's social and financial security than it does about her sexuality. The tension that Elizabeth would have had to resolve is she were free to leave home isn't between heterosexual marriage and loving woman, but between what marriage means for a woman's life and her own desire to live and to write freely as men do. What matters for her story is simply that Miss Mitford's affection is discerning, deep, and enduring. But at 32, Elizabeth has anxieties about how to be a literary woman all the same. Must she be a sacred monster? With conspicuous tastelessness, she tells her friend of her fear that in seeing Lady Dacre, I should see a woman of the masculine gender with her genius very prominent in the eccentricity of manner and sentiment, because apart from Miss Mitford, the only literary woman I ever knew was Lady Mary Shepherd, whose kindness and terribleness I equally remember. Elizabeth herself, of course, has proved all too feminine in her ability to fall damagingly for a male authority figure, but though she may look up into a literary friend she's making now, unlike Boyd, or indeed her father, they don't trap her to humiliating codependency, whatever their own feelings. It's not the inconceivable, for example, that the twice widowed John Kenyon is attracted to his pretty and gifted protege. At least that's the complexion Henrietta puts on their friendship. How would you like him to be your brother-in-law? She asked Sam. You must know that he is a great esteem of our greatest, dearest Ba. We torment her most terribly about him. Kenyon has been alone since his wife died in 1835, is charismatic, sociably kind, and wealthy. In short, he is a catch. But he is also a year older than Papa, and although she frequently speculates with Miss Mitford about her private life, Elizabeth never seems to put her own self into this romantic frame. Instead, ill health has returned to claim her for a second time. By summer 1838, she's coughing continually. Infection succeeds infection. In June, she has been sometimes very unwell and sometimes better. A cold this week threw me back a little. The lungs are said to be affected, while they do not respond as satisfactorily as heretofore as to the latest application of the stethoscope. Struggling for breath, she confined to her bed again, and my weakness increases, of course, under the remedies which successive attackers render necessary, but these remedies represent the very best treatment available. Papa has hired a personal physician to the young Queen Victoria. Dr. Chambers is renowned for using all still very modern stethoscope to diagnose the presence or absence of TB. He gives Elizabeth the all clear. Dr. Chambers, the sincerest of physicians, has told me that there seems to be no ulceration of lungs, or that he has grounds for hoping for my ultimate complete recovery. Yet by mid-August, it's clear that she has chronic lung disease of some kind. In this era before antibiotics, it's easy for a chest infection to become life-threatening, bronchitis, pneumonia, or pleurisy, especially if someone as unfit as Elizabeth. Consumption is far from the only fatal pulmonary condition. Indeed, Elizabeth's unusually isolated lifestyle makes her a less likely candidate for this contagious disease, and we know for no sufferers in her circle apart from her late Uncle Sam, who is far away in Jamaica for the last decade of his life. But by now, Elizabeth is a helpless being whose migrations have been so many months, been from bed to the sofa. She's coughing up some blood, though to be the result of breaking a blood vessel in a coughing fit, and Chambers has made an essential condition of by leaving this part of England for the winter. To stay at the risk of my life would be wistful and foolishness at once. And so at the end of August, turning back on literary London and her unfolding success as a poet, Elizabeth leaves for Devon, where after the usual tortuous decision-making, her father has allowed her to overwinter. She's too unwell to manage the 200-mile journey by carriage, but by August 25th, sees her at the docking boarding the Saturday breakfast time sailing for Plymouth. There she connects with the packet, a fast-stopping mail boat, which arrives in Torquay on the evening of August 1838. For all of her frailty, Elizabeth is a good traveler, the only lady on board who did not suffer from seasickness. Besides, she had made the journey alone. She accompanied by Bro and George and by Henrietta, who is by now desperate to escape the heavily supervised domestic round at Wimple Street. Henrietta's memories of the gay months she spent with Bro and Torquay 5 years ago mixed with guilt at leaving Arabella sisterless in Wimple Street, but Arabelle, as family most calls her, does have the Reverend Hunter, by now teenage daughter, Mary for company, and she and Henrietta have agreed to swap places at the turn of the year. At first, the siblings stay with their aunt and Uncle Headley, who have resided at Torquay for at last 2 or 3 years under Dr. Chambers' jurisdiction on account of my uncle's being affected in some similar way to myself. Headley, any uncle only by marriage, offers no clue to genetic predisposition. Besides, he will go on to a long, healthy life, dying in his 70s. But awkwardly, this house is too far from the sea for Elizabeth, who by now confined to an invalid chair. It is also rather cold, so it's agreed that from October 1st, she will take a terraced house in the seafront. The rent is $180 per annum, is high. Poor health represents good business for these South Devon towns, framed for their mild climate and unpolluted sea air. But Elizabeth pays and agrees to share the financial and legal responsibilities with Bummy, who is now closing up on her own home in rural Gloucestershire to resume the care of her eldest niece. However, the heavy lifting, literal as well as metaphorical, will be done by Elizabeth's new maid, a country girl from Lincolnshire called Elizabeth Crowe. Just before they left London, her predecessor, who had worked for the family for a couple of years, who had professed her willingness to come to go anywhere with me, announced that she hasn't well enough to come to Devon. Elizabeth, who, like all members of her class, tend to treat servants as invincible necessities, managing briefly to make sympathetic noises, and indeed, she is not well, poor thing, she does not. She looks so, and which are conspicuously muted compared with, for example, the terms in which she worries over Miss Mitford's dog Dash. Although perhaps this is a symptom of skepticism, we have some reason for suspecting fear of the sea voyage to have had little to do with the change. Elizabeth Crowe is altogether more robust. She is in her early 20s, strong and energetic, with a northerner's brisk manner. She's also intelligent, and as her mistress gradually realizes, she is an excellent young woman, intelligent, bright, and tempered, and feeling-hearted, more to me than a mere servant, since her heart works more than her hand in all she does for me, and her delight is Miss Mitford's book, Village, which gave her to read, which is true a thing as ever, was that of readers of higher degree. But even Crowe, as the Barretts call her, will be overruled by Elizabeth's new physician, Dr. Barry of Torquay, is a young man full of energy, with a countenance seeming to look towards life, devoted to his profession and rising rapidly into professional eminence, a young man with a young wife and child and baby unborn, an advocate of fresh air and early rising. He's initially certain his methods are working for Elizabeth. A month after her arrival, he declares that the respiration is clearer on the affected side. In fact, his regime leaves the patient haunted throughout my weakness, an obsessive sense of weakness, and such lowness of spirits that I could have cried all day if there were no exertion in crying. Dr. Barry forbids her London habit, very useful in enabling an invalid to get through a good deal of writing without fatigue, of lying in bed until 2, and forces Elizabeth out daily into the invalid chair, with the result that she seldom failed to come back quite exhausted and fit for nothing better than reading nonsense. Worse, on the occasion of my writing case being accidentally visible, have you been writing today, Miss Barrett? No. Did you write yesterday? Yes. Will you be so good as to not do so anymore? And again, you may have observed my directions and my idle lately, Miss Barrett. Yes. And within these last 3 weeks, you have never written any poetry? If you please to do this, neither I nor anyone else can do anything for you. Life got struck once again, as if she had never escaped from Gloucestershire, to be exiled in Torquay, away from her newly flourishing literary life, many of the people she loves is bad enough. These partings are dyings, she tells Arabella on the eve of George's departure for London. She means it literally, despite the doctor's assurances. It's not certain that she'll live to see absent friends and family again, but to be forbidden to write is to be denied what is to be now the central purpose of her life, as well as her habitual coping mechanism. Barry is just another of the long lines of medics who bans writing women from one of the activity that probably makes them feel better and stronger than any other. His idea that writing is overstimulating for the female but not the male system isn't new, nor is it about to vanish. 7 years from now, Elizabeth will manage to be funny as well as furious about this. I had a doctor once who thought I had done everything because he had carried the inkstand out of the room. He gravely thought poetry a sort of disease, a sort of fungus of the brain, and held as a serious opinion that nobody could be properly well or exercised as an art, which was true, he maintained, even of men. For women, it was a mortal malady and incapable of any common show of health under any circumstances. And at this moment, it's simply depressing. She had hoped, encouraged by Dr. C's permission to manage her without medical visits and to trust simply to God's son and heir. However, far from taking the patent off drugs, Barry was upped her dose of digitalis and added the blister and applied without any particular call for it the inhalations of what Dr. Barry won't tell me, for I asked him twice and was answered each time by an invasion. Things seems to be getting worse instead of better. The only bright spot in the autumnal gloom is that Papa has given permission for Bro to stay on in Devon, even though both men would prefer to return to London. Father and daughter share not only the tendency to hole up, but desire to keep their loved ones holed up with them, keeping Brosy in Torquay with nothing to do except chaperone his sisters prevents his having to return to Jamaica, but it is most also quench the energies of his life, to paraphrase Elizabeth's own perceptive phrase. Of course, there are compensations. Sheltered by the slant woods of Beacon Hill, the siblings' new home at 3 Beacon Terrace stands immediately upon the lovely bay, a few paces dividing our door from its waves, and nothing but the sweet south of congenial west wind can reach us. A handsome Regency mid-terrace is frontage, dressed with a wrought iron balcony and double-heighted ornamental pilasters, too roomy enough for many family members if she can persuade her father to part with. But as 1838 turns to 39, Elizabeth coughing continues to interrupt every activity, its convulsive rhythm forming the soundtrack to thought, so that putting sometimes lines of poetry, even without Dr. Barry's permission, feels almost impossible. At night, coughing destroys the very sleep that might give the body a chance to heal. Propped up on pillows, Elizabeth hacks her way through the insomniac small hours, nor till early summer does some good news interrupt this dour routine. On May 1839, R.B. Richard Barrett, the distant cousin who's been hounding his family through Chancery, died suddenly at the age of 50 after 1.5 illness caused by a fit of perplexity, leaving the years-long dispute unsettled, but putting a de facto end to his personal campaign. Put in September, death crosses Elizabeth's own threshold. Dr. Barry, by now her able and most kind physician, who for above a year has attended me almost every day, is taken ill with what seems at first to be rheumatic and nervous fever. He rallies, rallies and relapses a second time and dies before the end of the month. The patient is left with survivor's guilt that once again she takes somatic form. The physician was taken and the patient left, of course, deeply affected and shaken, exasperated by the 3 weeks without medical care that follows. She suffers my only attack of fever and imperviousness to sleep, having to move house on October 1st after a year's tenancy down at number 3 adds to the stress. Number 1, Beacon Terrace, 3 doors down, is a plainer, larger, and crucially a cheaper house. It's here that Dr. Barry's successor, Dr. Scully, comes to see her every day, not only medically, it appears, but to chat. He seldom leaves her under an hour and tells her all the news and the scandal of the neighborhood. Despite the administrations, by the end of the year, Elizabeth is still bedbound, not any thinner, although perhaps not fatter, and is carried to her sofa for a short time every day, but her coming into the drawing room has not been thought of yet, as Henrietta confides to Sam, who's been back in Jamaica for the last half a year. Last summer saw Arabella arrive in Torquay, and in 1839 gives way to 1840. The siblings settle in around Elizabeth's invalid routines. But in the April, a letter arrives with shocking news that changes everything. Their brother Sam has died. He contracted the probability mosquito-borne yellow fever, so-called because it can trigger jaundice, and died 2 months ago on February 17th, 1840. He has also fallen ill during his first Jamaican trip, but this time he knew he was dying, dictated his will, and asked for the last rites, which was refused him by Hope Waddell, a preacher whose ministry the family had enabled in a fit of self-righteous revivalism. During the young man's early stay on the island, Waddell had denounced him for sleeping around with enslaved women at that, and he decided that Sam was saying he had never taken the sacrament, and though thought lack of confirmation into the Anglican Church is no barrier to nonconformist communion, refused the 28-year-old's dying request, choosing instead comfortlessly to read him the Bible. In short, as bitter a death as possible, and though the family may not be aware of every detail, they understand the loneliness of it and the grief that follows. Everyone worries, especially about the effect on Elizabeth. Sure enough, she's poleaxed. It was a heavy blow for all of us, and I, being weak, you see, was struck down by a bodily blow in a moment without having time for tears. Just as the death of her mother, she seemed unable to cry. Once again, as when Uncle Sam died, her mourning was psychosomatic. Too weak to hold a pen, she goes into such a serious decline that Papa hurries to Torquay. Of course, he's terrified of losing another child, but the prolonged emergency of Elizabeth's health seems to paralyze him. Last June sees him writing to Seti back in town that it is a monstrous time since I left you, and I am wanted very much in London, so how to leave my beloved Ba, I know not, to fear this very mention of it, for she is indeed lamentably weak, and yet it is absolutely necessary I should go. I really know not how to act. Such vacillation is hardly reassuring for a teenager who might prefer paternal confidence to confidences. At 18, Seti has effectively been left in charge of Wimpole Street, while her elder brother Alfred studies at the newly founded University College London, and the other Octavius continues at home with a tutor, left in charge in preference to the family's rebel, 22-year-old world traveler and wannabe commissioned officer Henry, the son who seems unable to pick an occupation which is not unsurmountably objectable to Papa, but for once Papa has chosen well. Sete has always been one of his father's favorites, both my right and left hand, the child who has slept in his bed and for whom he couldn't be parted during the move from Hope End. The seventh son has developed a precocious confidence. The family boasts fondly about to each other. They particularly love his assurance in costuming himself in a long-tailed coat belonging to his elder brother to gatecrash an Oxford University presentation to the Queen on his marriage. This seems filial maturity allows Papa to remain at Elizabeth's bedside till the end of the year. Despite his father's presence, it seems that this period of grief and anxiety, both Bro and Arabella manage astonishingly to seize the day and conduct romances. Arabella scrapes sounds as though it may involve a beloved pony rather than a young man. Elizabeth may be able to afford new riding habits, like the one she buys Henrietta, but actual mounts, but be borrowed and relinquished when friends move away. Poor dearest Bella seems to have gone on a wild exception. She relieves a scolding after the perils and the real thorough fatigue of half running nearly 8 miles, but Bro's love affair appears to be a real thing. Last July, he was frankly mooning. Henrietta reported that he spent his time drawing, fishing, and smoking. His hair remains as long and lanky as ever. There is no hope for it now since Monty, Miss Garden, expressed his approbation of it. She is very anxious to return to Torquay, and no more so I expect than Bro is to see her. By June 1840, the moment is too passing. Elizabeth notes that her brother has stopped keeping his blind drawn and indeed ventures to show his whole face out of doors by twilight instead of waiting for such pitch dark for all the sisters teasing. So Elizabeth will later imply that this love affair is so serious that she had wanted to settle money on her favorite brother so he could marry. But in all such hopes and intrigues are in vain, for the following month Bro goes sailing with his friends of a Saturday and never returns. Boating is a Barrett family pleasure, one of which Bro is an old hand, and the weather on June 11th is fine. He goes out as if he has before with two of his friends, Mr. Varnick and Captain Clark, who is an ancient relative of mine, by the way. Both also experienced sailors on Vannick's well-equipped vessel, the La Belle Savage, where they aided by a professional crewman. All three gentlemen can swim, and nothing is amiss with the weather. So what happens next is a shocking mystery. As Papa writes to Wimple Street, they left at a little of the 12 o'clock, it seems, and up at this time, 11 o'clock Monday night, they have not been heard of. Further than that, on Saturday afternoon, about 1 after 3 o'clock, a gentleman on his couch about 4 miles on the east of Teignmouth saw a boat exactly corresponding to the one they went in, and about a mile from him when they observed it go down. He set sail immediately to the spot, when he says he reached in 4 or 5 minutes, but nothing whatever could he see belonging to her or to the party in her, although he remained almost the place for nearly 4 hours. And what is extraordinary, it does not appear that she upset, as he saw the point of her mast above the water so last that I cannot understand how someone did not keep upon the surface. The weekend drags on without either reassurance or confirmation of their worst fears. Henrietta, I think, scarcely can believe it, but weeps. Arabella does and weeps, but her fears, her faith bears her up while. On Sunday afternoon, Mr. Vannick and 2 others went over to Teignmouth, and there they heard that a boat coming 2 ladies, and I think 2 men or boys, and then been lost off Dawlish now, and it is supposed that the 2 of dear Bro's party have been taken their coats off and hence from their shirt sleeves, supposing that they were taken for women, up to the arrival for the mail. We caught as a straw at the possibility of their having gone to the Landship or near Lyme, or to Weymouth, or to Mr. Vannick, for the day before talked of going. On Tuesday, Henrietta does believe the worst, and she has hysterics. Elizabeth has from the outset been neither optimistic nor consoled by the faith. Her last words to her favorite brother, her petulant, now that momentary irritation will remain with her forever. Once again, her health collapses under the shock. Scarcely conscious, her mind wanders. She comes even closer to dying when she did at the news of Sam's death. Love and grief lodge in the body, making the immune system, the hormones, buckle, and reverend. As Papa says, it is a wonder to me that she lives, for her love for Bro was truly great and uninterrupted. It began in infancy and has gone on growing with her growth. She is always the addendum of all her secrets and plans. The family are left hanging for 3 weeks until at last, on August 4th, Bro's body is washed up nearby Babbacombe, along with the remains of Captain Clark and of the sailor, cruelly decomposed. All 3 are hastily buried just 2 days later in the local parish churchyard. The whole thing is both horrifying and uncanny. Until they had Bro's body, the family couldn't be absolutely certain that he was dead, whatever common sense told them. And even once, as it returned to them by the water, they don't, in a sense, have it because it's too destroyed to be viewed. In the coming months, Elizabeth must live on constantly in earshot of the sea that killed her brother. Now the breakers outside her window sound less like breathing than fighting for breath. In October, she tells Miss Mitford these walls and the sound of what is very fearful a few yards from them, That perpetual dashing sound has preyed on me. I have been crushed, trodden down. Not till December does her father feel that she's well enough for him to leave her and resume her London responsibilities. The meeting with bankers, lawyers, middlemen, and dealers that makes up a life of international trade. Yet what she wants, herself wants, is for everyone just to go away and leave her alone. She can't hear for anyone coming near her. Indeed, she would have to have us all to leave her, as she associates in her mind everyone and everything with her loss, and continuing ill health, intensified now by grief, forces her to overwinter once more to this dreadful place. Months roll over months. I know it is for good, but very hard to bear. Incredibly, in the spring of 1841, life does resume. Arabella, by now 27 and full of energy, gets involved in charitable work with the local school. She organizes tea and cake and a run of the grass for the children, just like the old days at Hope End. Henrietta is now turning 32, disapproves because the clergyman involved in high church. Still, she herself escapes the sick room as often as she can, her own grief for her own intimate Sam, and as much as for Bro, she goes relatively unacknowledged, and even a walk around the block must offer some relatively from constantly ministering to Elizabeth's health and feelings. Friendship would be more restorative. Still, Henrietta has a luncheon party here today. She goes out a good deal. Elizabeth confides to George in April, but one heart can't judge for another. Indeed, she herself is not so stricken that she cannot sit for a portrait, though she enjoins her brother, saying nothing of this, nor indeed of anything else spoken by me today. Anything else, as Papa's latest scheme, is by sight unseen in a state resigning along on the top of a mountain across from Herefordshire, bordered to the mountain blue black mountains of Wales, rather than free up assets to establish his sons in his own lives. Such a hilltop exile would be the nail of the perpetual exile for Elizabeth too, cut off from the medical advice and perhaps even more importantly, literary London. Luckily, the moment passes, so does the threatened worst of the world's compromise by which she would forfeit Devonshire's healthy air, yet remain in provincial exile at Clifton on the edge of Bristol. Exile matters particularly because, encouraged by her literary friends, Elizabeth is starting to write again. She's missed the deadline for contributing to Miss Mitford's 1840 Fiddens Tabulo, but now she acquires a new author correspondence who also provokes her to put pen to paper. Richard Hence Horne, just 3 years her senior, has lived an assuredly adventurous life, has failed to get into the East India Company. He joined the Mexican Navy in the early 20s, supervised shipwreck, mutiny, and onboard fire, and managed to break 2 ribs while swimming at the Niagara Falls. Back in London, he writes all this up for magazines, then parlays it into a literary career, producing fiction, drama, and history, and epic verse, and editing periodicals. It's all a far cry from Elizabeth's seaside sick room, yet the two develop a flourishing, if mismatched, friendship. It was a former Hope End governess, Miss Orme, who put them in touch, forwarding a letter to Horne from Elizabeth. Possibly she painted an alluring portrait of the invalid, or else stressed the straightness of her prison. But by now Elizabeth is widely published. Peers like Horne are interested in what she is doing anyway. In 1841, the two even tried to collaborate in a verse drama, Psyche Apocalypte. Through this project, loses momentum in the aftermath of Bro's death. Nevertheless, Horne is a typically rackety literary male, and the friendship worries Miss Mitford, responding to what may be either pure protectiveness or of just a touch of jealousy. Elizabeth justified it to her older friend in ways that strikingly prefigure how she'll frame her relationship with Mr. Browning. Here we will leave this lesson for another day about how Ba and Miss Mitford go on to have some kind of relationship where Miss Mitford ends up writing, or Ba does, 4 or 5 volumes of verse. So we will continue on with another story. Please like and subscribe. If if you enjoy anything I'm doing here, and have a great day.